Good evening, everybody. My name is Anthony Tamburri. I'm Dean of the John D. Calandra Italian American Institute, and this is an annual appointment that we have, and a pleasant one with regard to all of our friends here. And of course, it is a very somber topic, as we all know. There are a few thank yous. First of all, the whole idea of the activities around the Giorno della Memoria. We need to thank it's coordinated out of the Consulate General of Italy here in New York City. We need to thank the Consulate General, the Consul General, and all of his staff. We need to thank the Istituto Italiano di Cultura, who also collaborates. Then there, of course, the Centro Primo Levi, which is the most active of the organizations, and make sure that things get coordinated and that none of us really drop the ball. There, of course, is the Casa Italiana zerilli-marimò of NYU, the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies, and then finally the John D. Calandra Italian American Institute. And these are the 5 or 6 institutions that every year since I've been here have come together and developed various activities, some of them individual, some of them collaborative, as we are here tonight. I also need to thank 3 people who have made this, coordinated it beforehand, and have made it a success tonight, at least to the point where we are now. And that is Rosario Musco, who helped coordinate some of the previous pre-event activities. And then our 2 technicians, Carmine Pizzirusso from the Calandra Institute and Julian Sachs from the Casa Italiana zerilli-marimò. So why at the Calandra Institute? Why is the Calandra Institute involved in all of this? This is, after all, somebody might say a little bit skeptically, Italy, and not Italian America. This is true. However, some of us who deal also in Italian American studies believe that for you to understand the whole discourse of Italians in America, of Italians in other parts of the world, you really need to know, to a significant degree, Italian history, especially late 19th and 20th century Italian history. So here we are, here we shall be in the future. And so if there were any doubts as to why the John D. Calandra Italian American Institute is involved in a so-called Italian event, that's why. And I'm happy to discuss it at other times with anyone. That said, I want to ask Natalia Indrimi just to come up and say a few words. She is the director of the Centro Primo Levi here in New York City.
Thank you very much, Anthony. I'm delighted to be here tonight to present this program. We have done so many events in Bassani in 20 and something years of the activity of Centro Primo Levi, and each time is a new reading, because in fact, Bassani is someone who engaged the reader, who needs the complicity of the readers to get his message across and story across. And in this case, it's not just what Bassani discussed, the conversation of Bassani with the Italian public, but also the conversation of Bassani with the American public, which I believe has been probably his largest one. I mean, through the book and the film, the Finzi-Contini are an icon, probably the icon through which Italian Judaism and the Shoah in Italy have become known to the American public. And the way in which this has played out is quite interesting, and is what we are, part of what we're going to discuss tonight. I would just want to thank Stefano Albertini, because this whole project started with a conversation. Stefano had this idea of putting together a panel, and let's see how the opera developed from the book and from the film. And it is a really emblematic of the way in which we have been working for so many years. And I want to thank Stefano and Anthony for this, and Bianca for being here to take part in the conversation. So without further ado, thank you for attending tonight's event, and please participate.
Thank you, Natalia. And I'm going to pass the baton, metaphorical baton, to Stefano Albertini, who's the director of the Casa Italiana Zerilli-marimò. Prego, Stefano.
Grazie mille. We have a great panel and not a lot of time, so I will keep the introduction of the panel as short as possible, since you can go to our websites and find complete biographies for all of them. But just mention the names. You have already met Dean Anthony Tamburri of the Calandra Institute. He will talk about the transition from the book to the film. Should I take it off? Okay. The transition between the novel and the film, since he was a direct witness of Bassani's rant against the film while he was a graduate student at Berkeley and would usually play tennis with Giorgio Bassani. How can you resist the temptation of having him say what Bassani said about the film, right when it was still hot and scorching for him? We have Alessandro Cassin of the Centro Primo Levi, and with him we're going to talk more about the novel and the impact of the novel on the collective imagination in the United States of America. And here to my left, we have Bianca Finzi-Contini Calabresi, from her last name. You know that there is more than one reason already to have her. Bianca Calabresi is a professor and a scholar of comparative literature. We would say una rinascentista, early modern, so a scholar of early modern literatures. And today we are going to try to bring together both her family history and her expertise as a literature scholar. And also we have here with us, remotely but very present, Michael Korie, who is the librettist of the opera The Garden of the Finzi-Contini that just opened last Thursday at the National Yiddish Theater Folksbiene, a co-production of the Yiddish Theater and New York City Opera. And the composer is Ricky Ian Gordon. We're very lucky to have with us Michael Korie, that is the author of the newest incarnation of the Finzi-Contini. So without further ado, I would like to start this colloquium with 3 minutes of a clip of an interview with Judge Guido Calabresi, who happens to be Bianca's father, and whose mother was also Bianca Finzi-Contini. So the first question we ask the judge, as you will see, is, does the historical family, your historical maternal family, have something to do with the fictional family in the novel? And here is his answer. It's just a couple of minutes. You can see the whole interview on our websites of Centro Primo Levi, of Casa Italiana, so you look it up if you want, the entire thing.
The book is a book of fiction. And so the story in that book is not the story of my family, and it is not the story of any particular family. I can tell you many of the events that happened there and of the individual people who are there, whom Bassani used as inspiration for, so that this happened to this one, this happened to some, and some of those things happened to people in my mother's family, and some of these things, maybe more, happened to people in my father's family. But the book is not about us. On the other hand, Bassani picked the name intentionally. He wrote the book in my father's family's house, which was a house that goes back to the 13th century. It has magnificent frescoes.
In Ferrara.
In Ferrara, by a pupil of Giotto's. And today, part of that house is where his books and papers have been collected, because he wrote most of his things there, because my father's first cousin, who owned this house, was his patron. Helped him. Together they founded Italia Nostra, the preservation trust in Italy, and this older man looked after him.
Let's remember his name, Judge.
That was Giuseppe Minerbi, Beppe Minerbi, who was a great, and he was my father's closest friend, the same age, and they had grown up together. Bassani wrote many of his things, including the garden, much of it, in the library of this house. And in fact, when Anne, my wife, and I were on our wedding trip, we went there, and Bassani was in the library writing. He also dedicated one of his other books, The Heron, L'Airone, to Giuseppe Minerbi, the man who did that. Now, why did he, in my father's family's house, think of my mother's name? The reason I've always suspected, and now I know as a fact, is because his patron, Beppe Minervi, had a younger sister who married my mother's brother. So it was perfectly natural that he there would think of his patron's sister and think Finzi-Contini. And at that point, the name, because it connoted something in the Italian Jewish community, which I said, Mother, what does that mean? Why? And she said, well, I think he wanted a name that connoted aristocracy. I said, decadence. She said, it's the same thing.
I would take any chance to interview Judge Calabresi just about any topic. So the interview goes on. And again, you can watch it. For those of you who are not familiar with him, he was for several years Dean of the Yale Law School. He still teaches there. He started in 1959 and is still active. And I've never met one of his students that is not madly in love with Professor Calabresi and his teaching. Bianca, what was it like to grow up a Finzi-Contini, also in part, in America and in Italy? Does your name trigger reactions, or what it was like for you to discover the book and the history of your family?
Well, I think I discovered the book after I discovered the film, in a sense, at least my public experience of the name Finzi-Contini really happened after the film came out and conditioned a certain way of imagining that world that I think we'll be talking about. And at that point, I was very young, and I was very aware of the fact that nobody in my family that I knew of looked like Don Sanda. So that was usually my response.
Just remember, just for our audience,
Yeah.
the chronologies, the novel was written and published in 1962, and the film came out in 1970.
Yes, and circulated for quite a while.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I was very close to my grandmother, Bianca Maria. Not only was I named after her, but I felt as if I had sort of been selected to be the student of literature. She used to give me books from her library, and in fact took me to the Yale Library and showed me Folksbiene, the great encyclopedia of literature, when I started college, to make sure I had the right sources. So it was very much tied up with my experience of her, I think. I also have Finzi-Contini cousins in Italy, who I grew up knowing and I'm very close to. And we would go to Ferrara frequently to visit Beppe Minervi and his wife Olga. So for me, it was tied up with the family. And there was a kind of, but it was also always clear that it was fiction. And because I was interested in fiction as a genre, that was something apart.
Thank you very much, Bianca. And Alessandro, let's start talking about the novel, because it was a major event. Just briefly about Bassani, he was already a rather established writer. He had already won a Premio Strega, that is the most important literary prize in Italy, but really Giardino is what makes him. And he was a translator. He was a screenwriter who wrote for some of the most important directors in Italy at the time. We're going to talk about that later. But tell us something about the...
Last but not least, the poet.
The poet, yes, absolutely.
Exactly.
The novel, I mean, there's so much that one can say about the novel. But because there's so much there, what I'm tempted just to say one word to describe, which is masterpiece. But for the purpose of this discussion, I would like to try to unpack a little bit of what's in the novel, what's omitted in the novel that's equally important, and thirdly, background about the Jewish community in Ferrara. Let me start with this, with the novel. The novel main theme, and indeed Bassani's main theme, to me is the slow process by which the Jews of Ferrara, from 1929 to 1939, the dates are very clear, ceased to be citizens of a different religion, and became enemies of the motherland, potential spies, and killed the citizens. I think this is the main thing. There are three of the themes that are equally at play in the novel. I don't think that is the plot, but the themes are death solely, the sense of death and dying, the tomb, so many funerals and so many tombs in the work, love solely, and life. Life, I think, is represented mainly in this novel in the garden, in the vegetation, in the trees that survive, that are planted and that have century-long lives. Love is a more problematic topic because apparently it is the unrequited love between the narrator and the prey. I think in reality, there's that, and there's this overpowering, poetic, lyrical love of the author for Ferrara and its whole. The Jew and the non-Jew of Ferrara, I recall each one, every single character with great admiration and love. No nostalgia, great love. Having said that, I think it's important to remember that Cassin was massively talented. And the way he tells the story is so rare and sophisticated that the reader really needs to pay attention. What he has constructed is a huge poetic cycle in prose. He has written some 700 pages of prose that he has collected in the novel of Ferrara, which is a summation of what he had written between the 1950s and 1970s. In 1974, and then again in 80, he puts it all together in this great cycle. And this cycle, in my mind, has at its center the novel, The Garden of Finzi-Contini. And at the center of that, the humongous garden. In the heart of the garden, the character of Nicole. Now, this construction of cycles within cycles is how he tells the story of Ferrara. So, for instance, the whole work starts with what Stefano mentioned as Cinque Storie Ferraresi. And the first one of those stories, before the novel, which is part 3, the first novel, Vida Mantovani, introduces us for the first time to the garden of Finzi-Contini. So it's a hot summer night in Ferrara. Vida Mantovani is a Catholic girl of peasant origin who's having an affair with a Jewish boy of the aristocracy. It's hot as hell, they're having ice cream, and she tells him that she's pregnant. He cannot handle this information and starts telling where his family is vacationing. In the very sophisticated Cortina d'Ampezzo, in this magnificent hotel Miramonte. To give a sense of the unimaginable vastness of the Miramonte, he says it has a park that's even bigger than the Garden of the Finzi-Contini. And this is how he plants this name and this concept of the Garden of Finzi-Contini in his very first story. Or to give you another example, in the novel, The Garden of Finzi-Contini, there's a character, Bruno Lattis. Bruno Lattis is a tennis player that gets kicked out of the tennis tournament in fear that he might win. Bruno Lattis is a relatively minor character in the story of Finzi-Contini, but then he reappears at the end of the cycle in part 6, The Smell of the Hay, where there's a story that's called Further News on Bruno Lattis, which ties back to this character and how, what happens to him. Well, in this very circular way is how he constructs the novel. I think another thing that I'd like to say is so much, as I said, is despite the fact that there is a narrator who is telling us a story, I think that the author distributes his opinions and his thoughts in a lot of other characters. So it's not enough to say Bassani is the narrator. Bassani speaks to Malnate, to Paul, to almost all of the characters. And I think that this makes it much more complex construction.
Brilliant synthesis, Alessandro. I don't know how you did it, but you did it very well. Thank you. And now we transition Is there anything else we want to add before we move to
There's
the?
just one last thing.
Sure.
I think it's very important. Another Italian Jewish writer, Ilsa Morante, once said that you don't have to write poems to be a poet. Now, aside from the fact that Bassani did write poems, I think that this is a really poetic cycle, as I say. And I think that for the first time, this latest translation by Jimmy Mackenzie, I think for the first time really
Show the
highlights,
cover.
the poetic nature of Bassani's writing. And I think this is perhaps because this translator is himself a poet, and so he picks up so much of what's poetic, not only in the language, but in the conception of this work.
Thank you. Anthony, you're both a scholar of literature and of cinema. You published on both, but you're here because of your personal connection to Bassani and
Right.
those tennis matches at Berkeley when you would talk with him about his book and what happened to it in the film.
We did. We spoke often, although I must say he was reluctant. Stefano was referring to this, I would say, winter trimester at that time. The University of California, Berkeley was still on the trimester quarter system. And Bassani was there for 10 weeks. It was soon after the murder of Pierpaolo Pasolini. He came as part of what is the Italian-American fellowship program that was left by Amedeo Giannini. Mm-hmm. And so he was the professor for that year, the visiting professor, and he taught a seminar on Pasolini. However, the first thing he wanted to do in his first day was play tennis. And there were two of us who were known to have been tennis players. And so I was called up. I was just happened to be in the department. And so I was called in, Tamburri, vieni, il professore vuol giocare a tennis. That's how I was introduced to Giorgio Bassani, this mythic writer, right?
But that's perfect. We should remind our audience that is not very familiar with the novel or read it a long time ago. Tennis plays a central role.
Exactly.
These young people in Ferrara go to the garden of the Finzi-Contini mostly to play tennis, or at least that's why they start going.
Exactly.
So tennis is key.
Tennis is key. And tennis was actually key in his life, and I'll get to that. But so we went out and played tennis. So now I have to reveal that I got totally slaughtered I was something like 27, he was 58. And I remember that because I said to him, Professore, quante? And I always tell the story. I won a couple of games in the second set only because I was 27, he was 58. And I would say to him, Professor, quant'è che gioca? And he said, mezzo secolo. And I said, what do you mean mezzo secolo? And he said, 58 anni, ho cominciato a 8 anni. And so, and then he said to me, ma hai letto I miei libri? And I, which goes to what you're saying, the whole central, and I said, sì, ho visto anche il film. And he said, pessimo film. So I said, allora dobbiamo parlarne. No, and we left, whatever. So we did. We played tennis often, and he would invite me and a couple of other students. Occasionally we would go out to dinner with him. And so one night I sort of pushed him on it, and I said, I understand that the film is different, but you hate it. Why you despise it? You almost hate it. And he said, pessimo film. And he would never get this. So I asked him, and I said, well, because of the characters, right? And he said, well, no, there were other problems. And I said to him, who's Nicole modeled after? And he sort of pulled back a little bit. And nessuno, sai, gli scrittori scrivono così, perché poi, and then he said something which I thought was very interesting, a sort of defense mechanism. Per capire gli scrittori bisogna essere scrittori. And I looked at him and I said, really? I said, and what about us who are studying and stuff? Should we not then study Pasolini? And of course he laughed, whatever. But I pushed him on it a number of times. And I always felt that he felt, and it was interesting because one of you sent around the article.
We can tell our audience that the article is available in the English translation, both on the website of Casa Italiana and of Centro Primo Levi. Il mio giardino tradito, my
Right.
betrayed garden. And it's the article that Bassani writes to basically disown
To
De
disown,
Sica in his
right.
film.
And he told me the story that he had sued De Sica for two reasons. To get two things. One, to get his name removed as a screenwriter because he was one of the screenwriters, although he says in this article that he hadn't been in touch with them for the last few months that they were completing the film. And the other he says in here, which I think is really the crux of why he didn't like the movie, he says his characters were reduced to marionettes. And I think more than being reduced to marionettes, I think that Nicole was so different in the film than what she is in the novel that he just couldn't accept that. And there was another interesting thing that he said at one point. He said this in a sort of public venue. He said, this is 1976. The article had just appeared, I think. He said, the only person who ever understood my novel was an American, Marilyn Schneider. And Marilyn Schneider was a professor of Italian at the University of Minnesota. And she had published this article in 76 in the journal Italica. And the following year, when they reissued the Oscar edition of Il Giardino di Finzi-Contini, he had that included as part of the edition. And it was part of the Oscar for a number of years. But I really feel that I agree with him that there is this marionette sort of patina to some of the characters. And I think that, really it's the difference of Nicole. Because I would ask him, on a number of occasions, I would try to approach the subject of Nicola's character and the difference between the film. And always saying, the novel is one thing and the film is another. They're two separate texts. Of course, we can talk about adaptation, but we don't have to. And he just wasn't buying it. He just simply wasn't buying it. So my gut feeling is that Nicole is modeled after somebody, maybe some young, quote unquote, Nordic, blue-eyed, blonde-haired lass of Ferrara, But she just, and I think if you go back to read Marilyn Schneider's article, you'll see she really sort of makes an argument for this mythic Nicole in the book and doesn't really talk about the film, because her article came out in 76. So we're talking at least 4 or 5 years after the popularity of the film. And let me say this: you mentioned Bruno Lattis, that he was pulled out because he was too good. So the following year, our Italian-American visiting professor was Gianfranco Folena, right? Great philologist, and he knew Bassani. When they were young, they knew each other. And he said that if it weren't for the racial laws, it's very possible that Bassani would have been not only a champion of Italy, but perhaps even of Europe. That Bassani, when he was young, was that good. He was that good. Now, it always stuck in my head, what Folena, there was no reason for Folena to say that. Absolutely no reason. There was no reason for Folena to say that. So I think the characters, I think that's a really good place to start if we're going to talk about the film, the representation in the film, and the representation.
Alessandro, you seem to be willing to say something before we go to Michael. But use Anthony's microphone. This one is not working.
So I would just like to add a small tennis detail, which I think is some important for moviegoers. So the film adaptation of De Sica ends with a scene of slow motion tennis playing, which is obviously not how that novel ends. And I've always felt that ending has something to do with this other great Italian filmmaker from Ferrara, Antonioni. Antonioni, only 4 years prior to the film, the Finzi-Contini, in 1966, had made Blow Up. And in Blow Up, as a lot of you will remember, there's this surreal tennis game without the ball. So I think that there's a slight connection there.
Thank you. And before we proceed in our conversation, of course, we should go to Michael Korie, who is the librettist for the opera, The Garden of the Finzi-Contini. currently playing here in New York. You can find all the information on the opera and on how to book your tickets, again, in our website or in the website of New York City Opera. Michael, first of all, can you hear us? And were you able to follow the discussion so far?
Yes, I heard everything. It's an honor to be amongst you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, very well. Michael,
Great.
why don't you tell us how the idea came about of writing an opera, you as a librettist, and Ricky and Gordon as a composer, about the Garden of the Finzi-Contini? I know it has been in gestazione, in the making for quite a while, and why don't you tell about the very origin? Who had the idea, how it developed?
Absolutely. Well, first I should say how honored we were to be entrusted with this magnificent story, this iconic novel. And we wanted to express our appreciation to the family and the estate of Bassani for allowing two Americans to adapt it into an opera of all things. And it took 10 years. And through that time, we began to see changes in America that resembled some of the changes that were occurring to the characters in the novel in Italy. And we responded to it, and the estate and the family allowed us to continue our work, and we were very grateful. What happened is that both Ricky Gordon and I began life as a journalist, a 19-year-old journalist at a left-wing newspaper, The Village Voice. I became an editor. I wanted to write music, and somehow I didn't have anyone to write the words. So I became a librettist. And Ricky had a similar unusual path, and we really learned everything we learned in the musical theater. But our work was always trying to push the envelope, I guess, not fit into the mold of musical theater. We wanted to say more with the music. And it led us into opera, or a sort of hybrid opera. And Ricky found me one day in the corner grocery store. He lives on 70th Street on the west side. I live on 71st, and we often meet each other in the morning to buy milk for our coffee. And one day we must work together. And one day he said, "What would you think of adapting The Grapes of Wrath?" And I said, "Well, I think you're insane." But he said, "Go home and read it again." And I realized that it had an operatic form. And we did that. It was successful and got done a lot. And we wanted to do a follow-up piece. And the Garden of the Finzi-Continis occurred to Ricky. He called me up one night, very late, and said, "What about the Garden of the Finzi-Continis?" I said, "Oh, absolutely. I loved that. And I was familiar with it from the movie." But I said, "Let me read the book." And I read 2 translations of it, watched the film again, and I said, what I would really like to do is go back to the novel and adapt that, not the film. The novel has more, I think, of what will make an opera. Now, I'm not so sure that there is such a thing as a faithful adaptation of an opera from a novel, because they're such different forms. An opera has to sing, and so much of the novel was beautifully understated and implied. I don't think that you can have an implied opera. Maybe, a lot of modernist composers will do a reflection or an appreciation of a work instead of actually adapting it. But because we come from a theatrical background, we respond to character and situation, and we feel everyone needs their own sound. They can't all sound like the same composer rolled out by musical wallpaper. So we began to envision this in our mind, how we could possibly structure it as an opera. And one of the things that was mentioned already was the racial laws. That was, I think, something that was implicitly understood by readers of the novel when it came out post-war, and it was implied in the film. But knowing that we were going to open in the United States, which doesn't even know its own history, let alone the history of Italy during World War II, I don't think very many people were aware of the Manifesto della Razza. And I read it, and I said, this explains so much. It explains how a society of Jews who had become assimilated and comfortable in a country suddenly got their rights slowly taken away from them, and their environment constricted. And the very fact that Giorgio and Bruno Lattes and Adriano Trantini were not allowed to play in the tennis tournament at the Circolo Club was a result of the racial laws. And therefore, the reason why the Finzi-Contini family condescended to go to these people of a lower class and invite them into their garden. It was all motivated by the political change. And yet within this garden, there's a sense of delusion, of things happening outside the world, and a feeling of safety and protectedness. And it extended to all the characters. I saw it not just as about Michael and Giorgio and Malnate and Alberto, but I saw it as about all the families. And I saw it as a metaphor for what was happening in our country. And so that is the way we approached it, how it became real to us. Ricky imbued himself in Italian opera. He speaks Italian. And I worked with translators from the Metropolitan Opera and other places so that I could really get the intonations right. We mixed Italian into it. We also put Hebrew into it. And we also had to learn about the way Judaism was practiced in Italy, which was very different from either the Ashkenazi or the Sephardic approach. So it's been a wonderful challenge, a wonderful journey. I'm gratified that it's opening here and every ticket is sold out for the entire run. And opera companies are calling, interested in future productions. So I'm glad that the Garden of the Finzi-Continis through opera will find a new audience, which will then bring them back to the book.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. Congratulations for the sold out bill. I have a question for you, because I know that the opera is going on also tonight, and we would like to be there when it starts. One of the things I noticed is that a part of the novel that you develop in the opera, more than it is in the novel, is the relationship between Alberto and Malnate.
Yes.
That is, of course, it's hinted to in the book. It's sort of alluded in the film, and you somehow develop it in a more extended way. And so I wanted to ask you, how come you decided to sort of go into more depth into that relationship that is a homoerotic relationship, but not corresponded, as most of the relationships in this book, as Alessandro mentioned. And then after you, I'm going to ask the same question more or less to Bianca, who happens to be also a scholar of gender studies and queer studies. So her understanding of Bassani, the treatment of characters of this kind is also very interesting. Please, Michael. Your Alberto and Malnate story.
Yes, I would say that it came out of the needs of creating an opera. Structurally, I felt that we needed an act break. Opera singers need to rest their voices. You need an intermission, and the story was of a certain length. And as you know, Nicole goes off to Venice, back to college. Her family has the pull to get her back into school, though Giorgio himself is banned from the University of Bologna. He has to stay at home and read in Professor Romano's library. And so while Nicole is gone, I needed to continue the development of what was happening around them through the seasons she was gone, through the passing winter until Passover. And that left me Alberto. And I realized he's the Garden of the Finzi-Continis as much as anyone else. And the racial laws prevent him from leaving the country to find a specialist to treat his illness. He's trapped in this beautiful garden and he's dying. In fact, as we know, he's the only one who is buried in Ferrara. So I felt that would be a way of continuing the overall theme of the opera through developing these characters. Also, I'm a gay man, Ricky's a gay man, and we felt it in the novel. It was alluded to in the film, and I just felt it would enrich the musical texture and tapestry of the opera to develop them more. Now, some may take issue with that, call it a liberty, but I felt it was justified, and Bassani wrote about it.
Yes, very much so. And my question for Bianca is that Bassani, and then usually for writers of his generation, includes very often what we would now call gay characters in several of his works, including the protagonist of Gli Occhiali d'Oro, the Gold Rimmed Glasses, is a self-standing novel, and it's about Dr. Fatigati, who is a physician who's gay, and it's sort of his falling in disgrace. And I would say that more generally speaking, it seems that Bassani has an attention for the difference within the difference, the detail with which he describes the different groups within the Jewish community in Ferrara, to present groups and communities not as something that are a monolith altogether, but that there are differences within even minorities, and each person deserves a specific attention for what she or he is. But Bianca, what is your take on Bassani's homoeroticism in many of his works?
Well, I think it is a recurring theme, as you pointed out, and it's telling that Fatigati returns is mentioned at the end of Il Giardino by the narrator's father, after the narrator has had a conversation with Malnate, who is the object of erotic desire by potentially a number of characters, after he says some quite homophobic things. And the narrator distinguishes himself and says that is using a crude term, that is a Christian approach. And I think there has been some very good work that is starting to come out of queer theory. I'm thinking of the writings of John Champagne, trying to think about how we might see Jewish Italy as a kind of queer space, one that breaks down kinds of binaries. And that the Giardino of the Finzi-Contini can also be a site for that, and maybe the Giardino itself. So we think of it as being a place of retreat, but it is also a place in which I think different identities can be developed. And I think we see this also in Nicole, who is, of course, a scholar of Emily Dickinson. And I think the book, as much as it spends time on tennis, also spends time on scenes of reading. So there's a very important scene between the narrator and Nicole when they discuss a translation of an Emily Dickinson poem that is about death, and it is about beauty, and it is about what remains afterwards. And there's also a mention of Sara Coppia Sulam by the professor, her father, who has written a small monograph on this actual Seicento, early 17th century Jewish woman writer from Venice, of which there are now marvelous bilingual editions that I encourage people to go and see. And there are many reasons why he might mention Sara Coppia, but I think one of them is establishes a kind of alternative role for women, an intellectual role for women, women who are polyglot, who know many languages, like Nicole, like the actual women in that circle, including my grandmother, but also my aunts. So I think it becomes also a sign of what is being cut short, which is a world that Bassani recreates in some sense afterwards with his friendship with Pasolini, but also when he is publishing Bottega Oscure, the polyglot magazine, where he publishes, for example, Pasolini, but also Tom Gunn, May Sarton, Adrian Rich, very early on in their careers. And so I think that he does have some sense of alternatives to a very binary world, including, as you say, the binary of Jewish, non-Jewish.
Yes, and what you mentioned before also, the multilingualism. It's also one of the features of this spectrum that is so broad in the narrative. I think Anthony has something to say, and then
I
Natalia.
want to take it. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I tend not to use biography when I do literary criticism, but Bianca already mentioned Pasolini. On occasion we would chat with Bassani about his own works, and it was interesting. I remember him saying distinctly he could have never written Gli Occhiali d'Oro without having taken a road trip in 1953 with Pasolini. They went like from Italy to Spain. And I thought that was always really interesting because it's true. Malnate is this character he's like a magnet, pulling in both women and men, attracting both women and men. And the fact that, of course, we did Pasolini because Pasolini had been murdered, but he knew Pasolini. He knew Pasolini's work really well. He read it from that point of view in many ways, from a sort of biographical point of view.
Thank you, Anthony. Natalia.
I just wanted to take a very small detail, a very small piece of the book. Bassani doesn't describe. It doesn't want to tell us who are the Jews, who these people are, who the family is. He wants to engage the reader in what the reader thinks, and in particularly in the prejudice of the readers. So what he does, he takes something, and I think it's quite spectacular the way that it takes something that everybody can agree is a negative symbol, aristocracy. You take the fascist will be against aristocracy. The communist was his audience will be against aristocracy. The Jew, the Catholic, everybody will have some bad thought, some bad judgment on aristocracy, and he packs the Jews into this container. And so it lets the reader go ahead with a tranquil conscience with their prejudice. And this has manifested very well in the film. And then I think the opera has took the same approach, that we can actually intervene in society with art, being the good ones. Bassani doesn't think this. His father was a fascist. He lived through the dilemma of what adhering to political sides meant. He tried to understand, in fact, he tries to come to terms with who is this Jewish minority in this country. And it takes a long-term approach. In the opening of the novel, he speaks about Moise Finzi-Contini, the first, the father of the patriarch of the family. And he says, and he makes two, he bought a land in a moment in which the Jews, after the Napoleonic Wars, the Jews were able to buy some land. And this was a very rare thing. So he buys some land. And a paragraph later, he says, and then he made a burial place, a tomb for the family. And when he arrives there, he says, and he had no control. He had to completely leave control on how this burial place looked like. And what it looks like was the Egyptian, the Assyrians, which is very much the way in which in unified Italy, the Jews were conceived. All the synagogues were somehow an Oriental decoration to the new nation. So this is, and what Bassani is talking about, and this is, I think, very much at the core of the misunderstanding that is in the film, and I see is complete in the opera, that the Finzi-Contini are not rich, assimilated Jews. And Bassani is very clear in that making the artifice and then taking the carpet from beneath our feet when the young kid from the club.
Julia, maybe we can roll some images that you prepared from the film while you speak, because it shows the difference in the Passover.
The young kid from the 15-year-old kid from the club enters the villa. And the first thing it says that this is not a tennis court, this is a potato field. And that's how Bassani tells us, if we want to hear it, that the artifice of class is only for us to feel comfortable in our self-righteous position, not for, it's not his judgment, is not the Finzi-Contini. And the misunderstanding that the Finzi-Contini, as it was, I think Mr. Capasso said, are holiday Jews. It's so blatant. I mean, in the book, it's so obvious. They are the traditional ones. They are the ones who know Hebrew, who know the prayers. And it is very precisely described, the central scene of the book, when they go to the synagogue. The family of the narrator that is assimilated and enters modernity is a family that entered modernity, understood that fascism was progress. And this is what most Italians understood, that modern family, the father brings everybody under the taled when the prayer comes, and Bassani looks at him and he understands he cannot say the prayer. He doesn't know Hebrew. And then he looks under the taled of the Finzi-Contini and he hears not only the prayers that Hermano says, but the one of the Herreras, of the cousins, that are with the Spanish accent. So what Bassani is showing us is a way of being, how it feels to be Jewish from his perspective. It doesn't tell us who the Jews are. It puts us in front of what it is to be Jewish. And then he lets us, it gives us an outing, like a way out, packing this whole story into the artifice of class. But the Finzi-Contini are not aristocracy. They are, in fact, the symbol of the Jewish tradition that is going away, that is finishing, that cannot live in that setting that goes from the unification of Italy to the end of the war, and cannot live after. And I think that's something that is really at the core of what he resented of the interpretation of the film. That the film may put a step back. So now we show you what happened. And fortunately, we're good, and we have nothing to do with it. And that's what we continue to do. Of course, we are always involved in some ways in everything.
I think Bianca wants to respond to it.
I think that's a marvelous reading, Natalia, and understanding of what Bassani is doing. And I just wanted to add a little bit to that. Yes, the historic Finzi-Contini were not aristocrats of that sort. I think in his interview, in his objections, he says they were not Rothschilds, for example. And he really wants to point out that they are very specific to a place and time in terms of their experience. You talked about the audience, and I have found as I have gotten older, you asked me what it was like to grow up with this, but as I've gotten older and information has come out, for instance, from CIDEC, from the Fondazione Centro di Documentazione Ebraica Contemporanea, which is a vast database of information about Italian Jewry and what happened, particularly in the years between 43 and 45. So another wonderful resource is that the historical connection is complicated, and that Bassani is doing something very, it seems to me, very pointed, that many minoritized writers tend to do, which is that they are speaking to multiple audiences. And one of the audiences that he was speaking to were the remaining living Italian Jewish members of Ferrara and of the diaspora at that point. So when I met Albert Ascoli, who is a professor at Berkeley of Renaissance literature, he said to me, almost the first thing he said to me was, "It's your name, but it's our garden." And he really should have said our tennis court because, and he is right, his great aunt, Ida Magrini Ascoli, grew up in a large garden and house with a tennis court, one of the few private tennis courts. Before the war, her uncle Silvio Magrini, who often went by the name Finzi-Magrini, was a member of that circle, married to a Bassani, and they were deported to Auschwitz, and they died. And one interpretation of why, one story that I have heard from relatives of why Bassani chose Finzi-Contini instead was because he didn't want to use the name of a family that had been completely wiped out. Although, in fact, the family wasn't completely wiped out, and one could say that the library was the Bonfiglioli library, another family with whom Bassani collaborated, the Minervi, my cousin, that they also worked with him afterwards. So my experience reading this is I read something like the Cohen of Gioco del Pallone, who followed the Farnese rite, which is this Levantine rite. And I think, no, that's not right. Gioco del Pallone was the Minervi, and they were Italichim, you know. And my sense is that the internal community is experiencing a kind of dissonance or dysphoria about how their story is being told. That is the dissonance and dysphoria of the Italian Jews in 1938 with the racial laws, where they are confronted with a group identity that they would not subscribe to. And I think Bassani is also saying these are details, folks, at this point in history. Whether you're the Farnese rite or the Italian rite, or whether you live here or there. And so the tomb, I think, is a very potent symbol. He calls it un incredibile pasticcio, right? And McKendrick, I think, does a great job of translating it as an extraordinary mishmash. But in Italian, it would also mean a big mess, an incredible mess.
Also saying is that is what the outside world sees of the Jew.
Yes, but he's making a pasticcio. He's making a cooked, combined
but in
dish.
It doesn't say these are the real Jews, because
No,
there are no real
exactly.
Jews outside of the gates.
Exactly.
There are no real Christian outside of the gates.
Exactly. Exactly. But I think he's also saying to within the group, you know, he's reminding them of that experience, or reminding the minoritized group of that moment of dissonance. And
is looking at how each person responds to the solicitation of the outside. So when he describes, you know, we of the Italian synagogue, he uses two words very typical of the fascist propaganda. He says, le nostre facce franche aperte. He says that basically that Italian Jews have become, you know, spectacular and refined, and our faces are franche aperte, not like the Herrera, who are Sephardim and who speak some language that is unsure, you know, is uncertain, and what do they carry? That is the problem. They carry mystery, the mystery that cannot be in a society that is completely, you know, shaped by molds.
But I would say he's also questioning what does it mean to be assimilated, because the choice of the name Finzi-Contini, which apparently he was very happy with the hyphen. His daughter Paola Bassani says he used to laugh and with sort of or almost laugh with satisfaction about having added the hyphen there. But they were assimilated. I mean, anyone who names they're
the ones who carry the tradition, who speak Hebrew.
Exactly.
Nicole is in the kitchen.
Totally agree with you.
Chefitando, he uses a word that is Judeo-Italian.
You misunderstand me. You misunderstand me. The historical Finzi-Contini that I come from, my historical family, that name, you wouldn't you would not, for various reasons, you would not associate with exactly what you were saying, which is that they are the keepers of the tradition. I mean, anyone who names their daughter Bianca Maria.
No, I mean, you don't know what would have been without.
I do know my family's history in that particular regard. So I think he's also playing very much with that expectation, as you say, of who is observant, who is following the tradition properly for the insiders, for the Jewish community, and saying we have to reconceive what it means for us to be good Jewish people, good Jews. You know?
Allow me just to say a few things. Well, one hypothesis of why he did not use Finzi-Magrini or Magrini name is that Silvio Finzi-Magrini, in effect, was president of a Jewish community and one of the first 11 Jews to join the fascist party. So he probably did not want that specific connotation because he was doing a more general thing. But as we talk about these finer points about the Jews of Ferrara, I would just like to give a little bit of background on who these Jews were, because it's extraordinary.
This is very important. But before you start, I would like to ask our audience if you have any question or comments about both our live audience and our audience online. For our live audience, we'll ask you to just 1 minute. And we'll ask you to stand up and ask a question. For our audience online, please write your questions in the Q&A part of the Zoom screen. It should be down there. And then we'll try to answer as many as we can. We'll let Alessandro finish, and then we'll go first with your question.
Well, I think my question relates to what you're about to say.
Okay, I just want to very quickly give some numbers and dates, both about the very specific case study that the Jews of Ferrara represent in Italy and in Europe, and at the same time, how particular the fascism was in Ferrara as well in those years. So let's begin with the story of the Jews. The Jews.
Alessandro, Julian is telling me that Michael has to go because the opera will start shortly. So Michael, thank you very much for having been here with us. Congratulations on the opera, The Garden of the Finzi-Contini, and keep us posted on the next incarnations of it. Thank you.
I will. Thank you. And I hope there'll be a recording of it soon too. Thank you so much for including me. This has been wonderful.
Thank you, Michael. Alessandro, scusate.
No, okay, so let's go back to 1492 when the Jews get kicked out of Spain with Alhambra Decree. So when we think of Sephardic Jews, we think of people who spread all over the Mediterranean basin and the Ottoman Empire before settling in a specific city. The typical routes were Amsterdam and then maybe Constantinople as far as the island of Rhodes. They went everywhere, but they took them a long time to get to the final destination. Now, the very year that the Spanish king and queen decided on the expulsion of the Jews, the Duke of Ferrara, Ercole Primo, invited Jews to go to Ferrara. So this is really extraordinary in the story of Sephardic Jews, which this family in part represents in the novel, because they went directly to Ferrara, bringing with them their costumes, their religion, their foods, their way of, and they became immediately some kind of an elite, a very small minority elite within the pre-existing Jewish community in Ferrara. Ferrara is one of these cities in Italy that has a continuous Jewish presence since the Middle Ages. And so the arrival of the Sephardic Jews from Spain was a big event, and they collaborated in a very, very significant way to the Golden Age of Ferrara, which were the 15th and 16th century. This is very, very important. Why is this so important? Because okay, so first of all, the numbers were very small always. Ferrara is a city that today has 135,000 people. The Jews in the end of the 19th century in Ferrara were 1,800. By 1934, there were only 700 Jews. So we're talking about a tiny minority that had enormous difficulty in marrying within the the religion, and Bassani has very ironical eye on this problem and the smell of hay. But basically, during the 1930s up to 1938, 1 out of 3 Jews from Ferrara married a non-Jew. Okay, so what I was trying to say about fascism is that fascism in Ferrara really spread like wildfire. It went very, very fast. So in 1919, after World War I, there was an election where the Socialist Party gained 75% of the vote, 1919. The Fascist Party in Ferrara was constituted as the Fascio di Ferrara 1 year later, 1920. By 1921, in Ferrara, there were 7,000 card-carrying party members, which is more than in Milan, which is a much bigger city and where the movement began. So fascism in Ferrara was a very, very big thing. It began with enormous violence. Let me just mention the murder of Don Giovanni Minzoni in 1923, but there were just all kinds of terrible violence until the March on Rome. Now, Mussolini had an almost antagonistic attitude towards Ferrara. Ferrara was the home of Italo Balbo. Italo Balbo was the supposed heir to Mussolini. He had participated in the March on Rome, and he was really the major figure in Ferrara. Because of the presence of Italo Balbo in his idea of what fascism could be, and should be, Mussolini never went to Ferrara except one time for one day in 1925 to receive a degree. And he then went to Ferrara only after Balbo was killed. Now, Italo Balbo had a elementary school friend who's a lifelong friend called Renzo Ravenna. Renzo Ravenna is exceptional because he was the first and long-lasting Jewish podestà. Podestà was the Jewish term for mayor in Ferrara. So Ferrara had Jewish podestà from 1926 until 1938, where he was forced to resign. This creates a very, very, very different environment, and this is the environment of Bassani. I want to just say one thing that's really striking. While Bassani is historical, absolutely precise. He has dates, he has places, even in his poems he has dates. There is one number that he totally inflates, purposefully, for sure. I think there's a psychological reason here. He says over and over that 90% of the Jews of Ferrara were at some point fascists. This is absolutely not true. So Jews adhere to a fascist party in Italy in the same percentage than everybody else. But they participate in much higher number to anti-fascist and then the resistant movement. In the very height of Jewish participation to the fascist party in Ferrara, this was 1936, only 20% of the Jews did it. And if you go and see why, 20% is already a very high number, and it's because they had higher education and they were occupying elected posts by which to maintain your job, you had to be part of a party. So I think that there are many scholars who examined this, but in no way did the Jews of Ferrara were particularly fascist.
Thank you, Alessandro. Very, very much needed to understand the diversities within the community of Ferrara, and not only in terms of different rituals and liturgies and becomings, but also politically. Yes. How it was a community that had differences. There was dialectic between them, and these differences was what kept it alive and lively as a community.
And on a cultural and symbolic level, another thing that I think is fascinating is that the fascists in Ferrara mythicized the Renaissance, the Golden Age of Ferrara, the Este family. Now, the Este, as I said, had welcomed the Jews. So, in the hopes of the Jews of Ferrara, in the mythology of the fascist Jews of Ferrara, in the same way that they were been helped by the Este, they were now being helped by the fascists. So there's this mythologizing and reinventing history. Mussolini was talking about the new Rome. the Ferrara fascists were talking about the new Ferrara. And this all comes together, I think, for the 400th anniversary of Ariosto, great Renaissance poet, where Italo Balbo, who was called Il Maresciallo dell'Aria, the Marshal of the Air, proceeded to give a lecture on Il Volo d'Astolfo, in which he totally identified with a character in Ariosto, in this extraordinary way of, reviving the splendor of the past with a luminous presence under fascism.
Thank you, Alessandro. And of course, there is a lot to be said about the fascism claiming to be perfecting the Renaissance. There is an entire book called The Renaissance Perfected. It's about how fascism had the purpose, according to their intentions, of perfecting what the Renaissance did not complete. So in architectural terms, many places that now we associate to the Renaissance were actually perfected, that is, finished by fascists to make what their idea of Renaissance was. So it makes perfect sense, this idea of re-enabling those dynamics. I think we have a question from a member of the audience.
You answered part of my question, but looking at diversity within a minority population, just to help me understand. So, of Italian Jewry, probably the first arrival were the Roman Jews, and then much later, the Libyan. But am I correct in understanding the majority of the Jews in Ferrara were of Sephardic background? Sephardi and the people in Spain.
Right.
So, what was their route in terms of arriving in Ferrara?
So the question is about what are the origins of the Jews of Ferrara. By the time we're talking about, traditions were extremely mixed. I mean, it's.
But how did they arrive in Ferrara?
Well, Jews arrived in the oldest settlement in the peninsula or in the south of Italy, and Rome. And this,
yes,
so from these areas, slowly Jews began to go north for all sorts of reasons and settle north.
So some of them were initially Roman Jews.
You can say that they passed through Rome. Some were from Puglia, some from Sicily.
And if I understand correctly from what your father told me, the idea that they would call anything south of Rome Calabria.
Well,
so one of
this
the
is the explanation, at least in the family, for our name being Calabresi, because they have been Calabresi in the north since 1492-94, because, of course, all of the Spanish provinces in the south, when the Jews were expelled on the peninsula, also expelled the Jews from the Spanish provinces.
It's hard to know. Last names always have more complex stories than we.
There is a record of Alessandro Calabresi coming north as a grain merchant at that point, but people came for trade as well as in exile.
And people came from the south well before the Spanish. I mean, the early, the medieval Italian Jewry, it's very much centered in Puglia, in Calabria, in Sicily, and in Rome, around Rome. I mean, I think the area, the space in which he lives, and then it starts going up north and settling, in the Marche, in Umbria, and.
We have a few questions from the online audience, and one is asking about if you make anything, all of you, but probably Bianca would be more target for this question. You make anything of Nicole's mistranslation of Dickinson's word moss with erde, and Lawrence suggests there is a synonym for grass. We would suggest the other great 19th century American poet, Walt Whitman.
Well, one of the things that Nicole makes clear is that she knows American literature better than the narrator, because, of course, she refers to Bartleby the Scrivener, and he doesn't understand the reference, and she happens to have the edition right on her shelf. So I think, yes, I'd prefer not to. And they have a heated argument about it, and whether it's a proper interpretation. So I think Bassani, it's very interesting what Bassani is doing post-war, looking to American literature. But that is not my specialty. So I'll leave it to somebody else to discuss.
But, well, as we know, those of us who study 20th century Italian literature, American literature in the 20s, 30s, and 40s was very popular among the likes of Pavese, Vittorini, Calvino, etc. So, you know, there's Sorian, Wright, even John Fante is mentioned at times in some of the writings by Vittorini. So there was a certain freshness that I think American literature was seeing. Of course, Emily Dickinson, we're dealing with someone even earlier, right? And then the whole gender issue. And I think that's a little bit of Bassani's cleverness as a writer, if we can sort of, speculate, that is, that he wasn't this sort of loyal, quote unquote, Italian writer, but that he indeed looked beyond. Bottega Oscure was a different magazine. The magazine, sort of par excellence, was what Nuovi Argomenti, if I'm not mistaken, already back then. So that was the Italian magazine, whereas the Bottega Oscure, and also just the idea that it was called Bottega Oscure is just wonderful, right? But I wanted to get back to one thing. I think what we're doing here is exactly what Bassani would have wanted. And I think he would be here just sort of chuckling in the back room. Because let's remember, you know, it's legitimate, obviously, what we're doing, because literature is a reflection of society in many ways. But let us also remember what Bassani said. First of all, Bassani begins his writings, his literary career as a poet in 1951 with this little book, right? That's number one. So what does that mean? It means that he's extremely sensitive to language, That's number one. And then there are these sort of occasional turns in the novel, and you go, you know, and then at the end, of course, what does he say? What does he have his narrator say? Che bel romanzo, right? Which says, reader, go back, because you may have missed something, you know? And so I've always found that to be really clever on his part. And then, of course, he's writing before we have the onset of even narratology comes after Bassani, as far as all the critical tools and stuff, right? And of course, there's this thing called semiotics, but it's really in philosophy still. It's not brought to literature until, you know, especially in Italy, until we get the likes of Umberto Eco. So he has, as a writer, we can say this novel succeeds in ways that many do not. And of course, it lives on. One, I think, obviously, because of the subject matter, the general thematics. And two, because I think with this novel, he's just so competent as a narrator, as a writer, and then creating this. Remember, the narrator doesn't have a name, which I've always found fascinating. And I think that might have been something that Bassani, I wasn't sophisticated enough back then to ask him about that, but something that I think, you know, he probably didn't like, that De Sica gave him, because the fact that he doesn't have a name is really important in so many ways. And the only name he does have is Celestino, right? Which has, of course, a papal reference. Yeah. Dante and Pape, yeah.
So we are going towards the conclusion of this discussion. And I just wanted to ask the members of the panel, if you had the chance to see the opera, what you think of this latest incarnation of the Finzi-Contini in the opera. But I don't think we discussed enough the film. So if you, either Anthony or Alessandro, have something else that you want to say about you and the film, because we talked about Bassani as a very harsh critic of the film, but maybe there is something that you want to add. So either put together choose whatever two incarnations of the Finzi-Contini you want to put together.
Well, I would only say that once you've read the novel, it's really hard to look at the film in an objective way, precisely because there's a dramatic difference between the Nicole of the book and the Nicole of the film. And the end, that sense of, there's a real sense of tranquility at the end that this narrator is feeling that the narrator does not have. He's just hit over the head with a sledgehammer at the end. Whereas in the book, he says, pensavo, and then he says, continuava a ragionare. So he never saw anything. It's all in his head. He's imagining it, right? And that is where, again, I go back to Bassani's just hatred of this movie, is because of that. Because you lose then, whatever we've said about Nicole as symbol, you lose all that. In my opinion, you lose all that in the film.
And I'll follow up on this, and then because when I was growing up, The Garden was my favorite novel. I read it, I don't know how many times in a row, and I was madly in love with Nicole Finzi-Contini. As madly in love as a gay boy who's 16 can be in love with a literary character. But I was in love with Nicole, and I was totally taken by her. And so much so that I started ordering schivasta, that was my favorite drink. And bartenders would look at me and say, "What?" Because of course it's unknown, I discovered. But when I saw the film, I think for many reasons, I identified with Bassani, because being in love with Nicole, whether she's a fictional character or a person who really existed after which he created this character, seeing this suspicion becoming a reality, and of course cinema cannot allude or cannot make you imagine, it must show. So being confronted with, and in the film, as you know, there is the scene of Malnate and Nicole immediately after lovemaking. It's very obvious. Or in the opera too. I mean, you see Malnate coming out and she kissing him. So anything that goes in the direction of unveiling the mystery of Nicole, my beloved, it goes in the way. And I understand that that's the genius of Bassani.
Absolutely.
That
Absolutely.
he made me so enthralled in the story to fall in love with the girl he was in love with, and therefore to have the same protective reaction, especially because she's no longer. And therefore she cannot defend herself, and therefore she cannot say her version of the things. And leaving her shrouded in this uncertainty is the only way to protect her. So that was my...
I absolutely agree. I just want to add very briefly that, great literature rarely translates into anything else. And I think that Bassani, in this novel, in his work, resembles, if anybody else, Joyce very much. I don't have time to go into it, but for instance, I think that Ferrara is to Bassani what Dublin is to Joyce, particularly the Dubliners. There's a story in here called Gli ultimi giorni di Clelia Trotti, which is very, very similar in many levels, with a last story of the Dubliners, the dead. Okay, so in the same way that films on Ulysses have largely failed, I think that the task of the Sica was very, very difficult one.
Absolutely.
But I would like to just comment a little bit on the cover of this latest translation of the only translation of a complete novel of Ferrara, because I think it shows so much about America's attitude towards the whole thing. So here we have some kind of a metaphysical thing, drawing.
The Chirichesque.
The Chirichesque. Both De Chirico and Savigno lived in Ferrara. It mentions that it has a Finzi-Contini, because a Finzi-Contini is what he's famous for in America. And if you go here, I don't know if you could see, there's an image from the film. So I think that this cover really encapsulates America's love affair and attitude towards this author, where it's so difficult for an audience to differentiate and separate film, now opera, and the novel. again,
Yeah, we do.
you carry on. Very, very quickly, we did not speak enough about the opera. There are just two things in the opera that I find very, very difficult to accept historically. One is the portrayal of Perotti. Perotti is the driver, the housekeeper of the estate, the gardener. And in the novel, as in many instances of historical servants of Jewish families at that time, he was extremely loyal, and the opera makes him into an anti-Semite that calls Giorgio a Christ killer. So this is just not there, and I find it strident. In the same way, I find difficult this transformation, adoption of American concepts such as Jewish American princess, which is what they make Michael out to be, into a relationship with this novel, or the concept of Hermano being a self-hating Jew. Self-hating Jew is a term that developed in America. I think it has no parallel in the Italy that he talks about, and certainly not in the sensitivity of Giorgio Bassani towards the Jewish community.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Alessandro. In fact, just to mention my father's cousin Giovanni Finzi-Contini, who was the son of Bruno Finzi-Contini, the eldest son, wrote about his experiences and the family's historical experiences during post 43, and the work of his that is available in English that I think is most apropos is called A.M.'s Longest Journey, Il lungo viaggio di A.M., Alberto Minervi, and the role of this larger kinship network of households and interrelation between the extraordinary courage and generosity of the people, the Christians who worked for Jewish families in saving them, as well as many other non-Jewish people who took people into convents and hid them in caves, in their houses. It's not to say that there wasn't terrible anti-Semitism and that people didn't participate in it, but it is also, I think, very important to say that there were people who were above and beyond.
Thank you, Bianca. We have two quick questions, whoever can answer. From Nikki, compare the two translations that were read by Korie. Do you know anything about the two different translations?
Actually,
There are three.
Three.
Anyone in particular?
Translated very early on, and then Weaver.
First is a woman called
Quigley, and then Weaver, and then this one.
So there are three translations.
There are three translations that I know of. Yeah, yeah.
translations, and I think it has to be noted that, as I said at the beginning, Giorgio Bassani rewrote all of his
Do you want to
prose.
repeat the authors for the audience?
Yes,
The translators?
Quigley. I don't remember her name.
Was it Isabel?
Isabel Quigley.
Has all
Okay.
three. Has
Isabel Quigley, then William Weaver, and now Jamie McKendrick. I think that Jamie McKendrick translated the last editing of Bassani, Finzi-Contini, and Weaver did not. So this is the only one that is the latest Bassani edition.
Another quick question. Which of Bassani's stories do you think resembles Joyce the Dead?
The Last Days of Clelia Trotti, which is in part one of a novel of Ferrara.
Well, it just reminds me of Whitman again, though. The problem of which edition is the authentic edition and what we do about these multiple portraits. I think we read them all together as an incredibile pasticcio that is actually beautiful as opposed to horrific, unlike the two.
And I think we couldn't end with a better note than this. The incredibile pasticcio sometimes can be beautiful.
Let me just say one
please.
thing about, this is just, this happened. Let me just say one thing about Bassani's use of real models. Bassani wrote a novel that's not that popular, although it was translated, called Dietro la Porta. And it's a novel that we used when I was a graduate student in the advanced Italian classes, because it was an adolescent novel and all of that. And we had a fellow graduate student who went through the Italian university system and in Florence, and he turned to Bassani, this was an evening that with all the graduate students, and he turned to Bassani and he said, Cattolica in dietro la porta is Professor blah, blah, blah. And Bassani was just astounded that this friend of mine was able to figure out, and he said, yes, sì, è vero. So just to say that, some of his friends, I'm sure, may not have been too happy to have seen them reappear in his fiction.
Thank you. And I think the vitality of this conversation, of this discussion, and the fact that so many people followed us from their homes to talk about the Finzi-Contini, the historical ones. Bianca represents that continuity, even if in the fictionalized ways that we saw in the novel by Giorgio Bassani, that is definitely at the center of the creation of this collective idea of who Italian Jews are in this country. Basically, that's what triggered the interest of most people, and that's still what most people who are familiar with the topic still know is what they learned from Giorgio Bassani. And of course, Vittorio De Sica decided to do his own film, very much so, putting a big signature on it, as you would expect from a personality like him. And I think symbolically, the idea that there is a new opera is the quintessential art form, Italian art form. Opera was born in Italy, a few miles from Ferrara, in Mantua, and it still is the art form that is more identified with Italy. And the fact that it's two American composer and librettist that bring an Italian story, a quintessential Italian story, to become an opera in America, I think symbolically it is a great achievement, and we are here also to celebrate that. And I thank the members of the panel and my friends at Centro Primo Levi, with whom we constantly collaborate for many things, and Anthony for being a great host and a great witness.
And our two technicians.
Grazie mille a tutti.